I just hadn't really given this, but
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Ayres, and I'm Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of this important new book, The Zelensky Effect, by Dr. Olya Onuk and Dr. Henry Hale. We had actually intended to launch this book last semester, and some logistical issues prevented us from doing that. So what better way to kick off our new semester here, the new academic year, than by celebrating a work of scholarship that offers insights on and is really embedded in the middle of one of the most significant geopolitical moments before us. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, onlookers have been stunned by its brutality, its violence, and its disregard for long-held international norms, including over the most basic question of territorial sovereignty. Now, a year and a half on, Ukraine's heroic resistance to invasion has drawn global attention to the country's strength of national identity and its civil society. So against this backdrop, The Zelensky Effect, by our two co-authors, was published in November 2022. The book argues that we need to better understand Volodymyr Zelensky to understand the war and the events of the last year and a half. As the authors state, this book is not so much about the man himself than it is about the civic nation he embodies. The Zelensky Effect explores, and I'm quoting from the authors, explores Ukraine's national history to show how its now iconic president reflects the hopes and frustrations of the country's first independence generation. The authors draw on President Zelensky's life and career to tell the story of Ukraine. So today we will hear from the Zelensky Effect's co-authors. Henry Hale is professor of political science and international affairs here at GW Elliott School. He is also co-director of the program on new approaches to research and security in Eurasia, fondly known as PONARS, I'm sure to everyone here. He's also director of the Petrach Program on Ukraine, which has specialized in researching contemporary Ukrainian politics, society, and culture since its creation in the mid-1990s. Professor Olya Onuk is professor of comparative and Ukrainian politics at the University of Manchester. In addition to the Zelensky Effect, she is also the author of Mapping Mass Mobilization, which compares revolutionary moments in Argentina and Ukraine. And moderating today's conversation will be Professor Bob Ortung. Professor Ortung came to GW in 2011 after working at the Open Media Research Institute, East-West Institute, American University's Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, and the Jefferson Institute. He is a faculty member of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And in correlation with his work at GW, he is also a visiting fellow at the Center for Security Studies of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, Zurich. So with that, Bob, I turn the proceedings over to you to get us started.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So first thing I'm going to do is turn it over to Olya to give their presentation.
So, are there any students in the room? Hey, who was the first student in the room? Does anyone remember? You didn't know each other was in the room, so you don't know. Let's see those hands again. Okay, we have 3, not 4 books, so it will be a little bit of a difficulty. I promised the first student to get a book. So does anyone know who the real Vasyl Holoborodko is, or who Vasyl Holoborodko is? No. Does anyone want to venture a guess? I'll accept 2 different answers. No? No Ukrainians in the room? I think there's Professor Kizun that might help. Well, we'll solve this issue of which student gets the books a little bit later.
But find a fourth.
Or we will find a fourth. You're absolutely right. But that's on you, Henry. I fly out tomorrow. So my name is Olya Onuk. And who is the real Vasyl Holoborodko is a great question. This is the main character of a certain Netflix show called Servant of the People. And that certain character is the main character, and of course played by Volodymyr Zelensky. Except the real Vasyl Holoborodko is actually a famous poet dissident. Now, the real Vasyl Holoborodko did not like very much that his name was used in the series. The writers of the series, including Zelensky himself, have denied that, in fact, this is what the character is based on. But knowing what we know, about how much Volodymyr Zelensky is interested in history and in the role of civic history and civic engagement, and how much he has talked about these figures and characters in his many speeches over time, we think that perhaps, in fact, they were referring ever so slightly to the real Vasily Holoborodko. But let's now turn to the presentation. The image you've seen, I'm sure, before. In the middle of the night in Kiev, and Volodymyr Zelensky is addressing the people of Ukraine. He is saying, "Ya tut, I am here. Me tut." They're not going to leave. Multiple attempts at his life, the life of his children, the life of his wife, that are in a separate location. So, fearless, earnest, Russian target number one, the man in the green t-shirt or t-shirt and jumper, as may be the case here. As Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time on screens worldwide and on your own screens, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has captured the global imagination, and perhaps your own imagination, like no one else. Just 3 years ago, prior to this image, Zelensky was still just a television star, whose main qualifications for the Ukrainian presidency seems to be having played one on TV. The Kremlin saw him as a pushover. Perhaps so did many folks in this very city and in cities around Western Europe and the West more broadly. Rarely has a politician so visibly surprised so many. The man some Ukrainians affectionately call Ze and some not so affectionately at all, has come to symbolize the nation's fierce resistance to what many experts initially thought was truly a Russian juggernaut. Yet, this full-on Ukrainian mobilization and Zelensky's potential to rally it should have been no surprise. In fact, this is why we write the book. The reason for its success is not that Zelensky's special leadership traits set him apart from his country, but rather instead that what is making him extraordinary in war comes from his very ordinariness as a Ukrainian. And as such, he inherits a tradition of dissent and fierce civic sense that is baked into the country's identity. So we start our book, in fact, with that period of early transition to democracy and those last days of the Soviet period. We talk about the dissidents that rallied before folks like Zelensky and others, part of the so-called independence generation. We talk about this birth of an independence generation. People like himself, who are between the ages of approximately 6 and 16 at the time Ukraine becomes independent. Folks like myself, in their 40s now, who remember and have a living memory of what the Soviet period was like. Certainly were not able to engage in any of the events that unfolded in the immediate period. And then they also remember that period of the wild, wild east of the 1990s. They were coming into their own. Most of them turn around 20 around the Orange Revolution. Some of them rally to engage in the civic nation and protest. Zelensky, not quite yet. So this shouldn't have been a surprise because, in fact, Zelensky knew things about his fellow Ukrainians. And which one do I? Yes. Zelensky knew certain things about his fellow Ukrainians because he was an ordinary Ukrainian growing up in Kryvyi in Eastern Ukraine, speaking Russian at home. But he did understand that civic national identity grew after 1991 and was something of a very strong root for most Ukrainian citizens. Some of them may have been Russophones, some of them may have been ethnically Russian or Polish or Hungarian or Crimean Tatar. But that sense of civic duty to the state, to the nation state of Ukraine was increasingly strong. He also knew very well that history of civic engagement and mass mobilization and those periods of expectation and euphoria, and then later disappointment, be it in 1991 with the student hunger strike and the so-called revolution on the granite, be it with the Ukraine without Kuchma protests in the 2000s, be it with the Orange Revolution in 2004 or the Euromaidan in 2013-14. Zelensky may not have been an early riser to disengagement, but he certainly knew the history of it. He obviously portrayed many of these aspects in the Servant of the People show. And that is in fact how we know that he was aware of a lot of these things even prior to campaigning for the presidency, because he talked about them through his chosen art or entertainment, be it in this show or be it in theatrical performances and songs. And what Henry and I do in order to confirm this is discourse and content analysis of these, of the show, of the theatrical performances, but also of all his speeches and campaign documentation before 2019, during the 2019 presidential campaign, and then again following the all-out Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. But the thing is, we started talking about the Zelensky effect in our team of researchers with the IBIF project and then separately in the Mobilize project about the Zelensky effect quite early on. So what we know in 2019 is that those who voted for Zelensky, specifically young males who wanted to migrate abroad for a better future, by July 2019, just a few months later, already were declaring that they no longer want to go abroad for a better future. These were people who voted for Zelensky and his party. That's when I asked some of my colleagues, is this the Zelensky effect that we're seeing? That was just the tip of the iceberg. Because although some were surprised by that response by ordinary Ukrainians with tractors in their bare hands trying to stop tanks and engaging en masse, in fact, 80% of the civilian population engaging in the war effort in some way, that shouldn't have been a surprise. Why not? Zelensky knew this. Zelensky knew probably better than ourselves following the data that Ukrainians were going to double down on democracy. What we find is that support for democracy between when Zelensky is elected in 2019 and on the eve of all-out invasion, I believe the last data point for our survey then was February 15th, support for democracy rises at a quite alarming rate to political scientists who have never seen anything like this before. And indeed, I went and checked across Latin America that I study, across Central and Eastern Europe. We have not seen such a sharp rise in support for democracy amongst the population. Who were those rallying to democracy around this time, over the time of the pandemic, economic crisis, ongoing war? There were people in the southeast of Ukraine. They were Russophones, and they were people who voted for Zelensky or his party. So this is the Zelensky effect. On the one hand, it's the very fact that Zelensky embodies the civic nation. It is the civic nation that made him who he is today. Without the Ukrainian civic nation and its engagement and the rallying around the state that people from his generation did time and time again, we wouldn't have had the Zelensky that we have in 2019. And then there's that really important other side of the coin, the direct effect that Zelensky, through his rhetoric, be it as president or as a fictional president on a television show, and how he talked about democracy, and how he talked about civic engagement, and how he talked about the duty of citizens to pay their taxes, and that which divides them, such as language practice, is nowhere near as important or strong as that which unites them, their ability to rally around the state. And that's what you have today unfolding, sadly, on the steps and streets of Ukraine, but certainly something that we think is really important and something that we wanted to tell the story of in our book. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to follow up a little bit by talking a bit about the book itself and the structure of it. Olya has addressed what is kind of the core part of the book, which is the question of why was it that Ukrainians so successfully mobilized and resisted in the face of this all-out invasion from a much more powerful, it had appeared, neighbor, and in this brutal conflict. And as you can tell from the answer that Olya gave, our answer is not simply that, well, it was some hero leader who rescued the nation, right? Instead, the argument is that Zelensky is much more reflective of the country as a whole. And so the story is much more about Ukraine and Ukrainian identity than it is Zelensky himself. And so the story we tell about Zelensky is the story of him as a Ukrainian. And the book has therefore been structured accordingly. So it's really a book about the history of Ukraine, the history of Ukrainian identity told at different levels. So kind of at one level, we tell this story as a political history of Ukraine from independence on. And we tell it through the lens of its people, looking at survey data that we've kind of tracked over the years, how people themselves thought about Ukraine and Ukrainianness, Russia. And so this is part of where we tell the story of the development of Ukrainian identity over time and the strengthening of it. Then kind of the other cut is kind of within this general larger story, we talk about the independence generation, sort of one generation of Ukrainians that rose up, of which Zelensky is a part, who are now in leadership positions in Ukraine. And then within that, we focus on Zelensky himself, telling aspects about how he developed personally, how his leadership style emerged, where he got his team, and as best we can, tracing his ideas and message throughout the years. And so in terms of how the book is structured, we first start out with chapter 1 being an overview. And then the second chapter is about the independence generation, which takes us from independent Ukraine through the Orange Revolution, and does talk about Zelensky's childhood, which I think it gives us some insight into where he is coming up. And chapter 3 focuses on, we call this chapter Orange is the New Corruption. And so this is about the Orange Revolution and the disappointment that it brought to many people in Ukraine, just because there were such high hopes for overcoming a lot of the problems that had faced the country after the post-Soviet transition. But as has often happened, you've had these periods of mass mobilization that have been so impressive and have had an inspiring agenda and inspired many people, followed by periods of disappointment when leaders just didn't follow through. And so this is the kind of backdrop against which Zelensky was able to rise, and that colored a lot of people's perceptions of him. And so this chapter takes us through Viktor Yanukovych's turn away from Europe. And so that was one of the consequences of the Orange Revolution's disappointment, the disillusionment. People became so unhappy that they actually voted in the person who was trying to steal the election that provoked the Orange Revolution in the first place. So we got back to Viktor Yanukovych as president, and he started pulling Ukraine away from Europe and away from democratic standards. And of course, this is what provoked in the end another uprising against what he was doing. And this was the Euromaidan mass mobilization, which ultimately resulted in a new turnover in power and resulted in Russia trying to take advantage of the situation by annexing Crimea, fomenting insurgency in eastern Ukraine, in certain parts of the Donbass region. And so chapter 4 deals with this period, starting with the Euromaidan, and we call it the art of politics. And this is where we really start to get into Zelensky's rise to political prominence, including his television show and the emergence of his party. And one of the things that we try to talk about in this particular part of the book is how he was really misunderstood in a lot of ways. And so this trope of him as a comedian politician really underestimated a lot of what his life experience had meant. So for one thing, I mean, it wasn't always known that he had wanted to be a diplomat when he was growing up. And in fact, he went to a special school where he was speaking English for these reasons. When he went to college, he had a degree in law, looking at international law and economics. And so it was really his entertainment career that started to take off in a parallel fashion that broke him away from that. But one of the things we also talk about is once he even went into entertainment, I mean, he was a very political guy, not just because of what he was saying in his political messages and the satire, but also just because of becoming a successful media business person. He rose all the way to the top of being general producer for Ukraine's most popular television station at the time. And this was during the era of Yanukovych. And so he had to navigate all this. This was a highly, highly political position. And in some of his interviews, he describes basically being wooed and recruited by Yanukovych, and describes wrestling with how to navigate, what he describes as wanting to present a fair version of the news with orders coming from above not to do so. And so this was a very difficult period for him. And, he made some choices that a lot of people might have issues with in terms of, his decision, as he describes it, was basically, okay, well, I'm going to let other people deal with the news content. And so he kind of recused himself from dealing with the news as general producer of this channel. And this news at this time was highly biased in favor of the regime. But he said, I'm going to tell the truth through satire, which is a way to do it. And so his satire was very politically biting. But all this required tremendous political skills to navigate. And so he was very much a political creature in the way that he had to rise up and the way that he was trying to communicate a certain kind of message. And just in Ukraine's context, it could not be a non-political position. So in chapter 5, we focus on his election campaign and what brought him to the presidency. And so again, this is a place where I think there's a lot of misunderstandings of what he was about. A lot of the news reporting coming from Ukraine in 2019 described a almost frivolous campaign, someone who didn't pay any attention to politicking, didn't engage in the regular types of campaigning activities such as debates. He only participated in one big debate, didn't have any regular campaign, was just relying on social media. But one of the things that we try to show is that, in fact, there was a very clear message that he was communicating in lots of different ways. And it was a message about Ukrainian identity. And in particular, this Ukrainian civic identity that Olya was talking about, one that's very inclusive of all Ukrainians and is based more on the common experiences of Ukrainians. And it was very different from a lot of the identity messages that were coming from other parts of Ukraine, which had focused more on language or, kind of having the right language or having the right religion and these things. And so but he was really articulating this in a powerful way through his satire, through his television show, and lots of other programming, and through social media, which he was very, very adept at using. And so we call this chapter the virtual incumbent, because in some ways his campaign for president was much like an incumbent president would run for president, right? Incumbents don't like to appear like politicians because their best strategy is usually to appear presidential. And presidents don't kind of pander to the electorate in an obvious way. You don't want to debate rivals who really aren't up to you. And so they just go about doing their own job. And they say, well, I'm just doing my job. I'm not really campaigning. And so he kind of did his own job in the same way, which meant continuing his concerts, continuing performing, and continuing to appear on television. Plus, he was playing a president on TV. And so this was a great opportunity for him to convey to people the kind of president that he would be. Of course, it was with a lot of irony and a lot of satire. It was done in a comedic way. But nevertheless, there were important messages in these shows that he was getting out, and not really even all that subtle, about the nature of Ukrainianness, about the civic duty that ordinary Ukrainians have to help make their society better, And this resonated very, very powerfully with the electorate and led to his winning by effectively the largest majority in presidential election history in Ukraine. So chapter 6 deals with his presidency, and there we try to assess different aspects of what he has done. Again, we didn't structure the book around kind of picking out all the flaws or trying to, kind of praise everything that he's done, but to look in a kind of balanced way at how he stacks up compared to other presidents in Ukraine's history. And, we find there are areas that one could certainly criticize him on and failures. And there was a drop in his popularity that basically more or less progressed until you get up to February of 2022. But you have to consider the Ukrainian context where, again, you've had these, time after time, we've had popular presidents who've gotten bogged down in the country's problems. Their popularity has suffered and they've lost election or been ousted one way or other. And so if you compare, for example, his public opinion ratings compared to those of others, say 3 years out from the point at which they were elected, he actually does much better than the others. And so, even though there's clearly problems, he was still doing pretty well, and he had to deal with COVID, among other things. And all this is kind of to point out that he was a much more successful president than one would have expected if he was just a comedian who had come into office as a complete political novice and didn't really know what he was doing at all. And so this was kind of the backdrop then that led to chapter 7, which is Zelensky and Ukraine at war. Basically, the Zelensky Effect at war, I think is what we call the title. And here we try to make the point that, some people say that, well, there was a new Zelensky that appeared with February, with the all-out invasion. And we argue that, no, actually, there was very little that was actually new there, that in fact, the qualities that led him to be effective as a leader during wartime, for rallying the nation, helping inspire people, communicating, these were all things that you can trace very directly to not only his presidency and not only his campaign, but much earlier as well, certainly back at least to 2014, including his message of national unity that transcended any kind of ethnic qualities to the civic aspect of national identity, his calls to civic duty, which had been there very much from the beginning, all the way down to a lot of the symbolism, including his green T-shirt, which occasionally would appear, when he'd be speaking to troops or doing something that had to do with the military. So again, there are clearly some differences, some aspects on which he has evolved over time. One aspect that we mentioned was in his campaign, he campaigned effectively on a peace platform, which was, well, let's just sit down with Putin. He's a reasonable guy. We can find a way just to end the killing. We could just end the killing, right? That was his position, which in retrospect, of course, now, seems kind of obviously naive. But once he got to the presidency, it's clear that he quickly kind of realized that this was in fact naive. And he started to adjust his policies and realize, okay, we have to act in a different way. This is not going to be an option moving forward from us. We can't count on reasonableness coming out of Moscow in terms of negotiations. And so, there are some elements where he's changed and evolved, but for the vast bulk of it, in terms of his core messages of civic duty, civic identity, calls to arms, that kind of for improving society, these things are all very, very constant. And also, again, his communications messages, right? His techniques, his use of social media to help rally people and communicate. And then finally, chapter 8 is thinking about Ukraine's future history. And it's interesting, again, Olya mentioned the dissidents. He pays a lot of attention to history, and even the main character of his show, Servant of the People, which is about an accidental president. In the show, that character is a teacher of history. And so there are lots of ways in which he tries to think about this. So we try to examine a bit of this and think about what Ukraine's future may or should be. And so we're happy to talk about that with you. We recently had a foreign affairs piece which developed some of our ideas on this. But again, very briefly, we think that while on one hand, there's a lot of reason for hope for Ukraine, given how it has stood up and mobilized in the way that it has, and under a unifying rather than a divisive or divided type of national identity, calls for duty, lots of spontaneous mass mobilization that has taken place that clearly could translate into a vibrant, democratizing society. But at the same time, there are big concerns, right? Whenever you have somebody reach such pinnacles of power and influence, the temptation arises to kind of equate the state with yourself. It doesn't appear like there's any other leaders who can do it. There's a wartime imperative towards centralization that he acts on periodically, right? Which involves things like removing local mayors or taking under presidential control, taking certain decisions that might be needed for central, from the perspective of centralizing response, but that also run up against kind of a countervailing influence, which is the importance of mass mobilization and local mobilization towards effectively fending off the Russians. So much of this has been spontaneous coming at the local level. So there's a tension between the kind of bottom-up grassroots mobilization and the top-down military imperative, both of which have been important in fighting the war. You have to have an organized military, but you also have to have the mass mobilization. And so there's certain risks and dangers there that Ukraine has and needs to deal with. And so we wrestle with some of these in the concluding chapter. So there's a lot more that I could say about it, but I think at this point, maybe we'll leave the rest of the time to just questions and discussion, and we're happy to talk about whatever it is you're interested in talking about, Ukraine, Zelensky, related topics. So thanks again for coming.
All right. Well, thank you very much for a great presentation of the book. So let's open the floor to questions, and please raise your hand and identify yourself. We'll start here. I think then there's a microphone coming. Yes.
I'm still on? Yeah. Hi, I'm Chris Ellison. I'm the editor here at IERES. I'd like to ask Henry a question about building on what you were talking about at the end with the problems on the horizon and how do you wrestle with them. Zelensky is holding out against a country known for its unfree and unfair elections. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election in the middle of a civil war. There's debate about whether Zelensky will hold elections as scheduled. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, so I'll start out, and then Olya definitely has things to say on this. So he promised to only be president for one term. That was part of his campaigning for office. Personally, I would be surprised if he stuck with that now. I think if anybody ever had a reason to kind of go back on a campaign promise to step down at a certain point, that would be now. The election is scheduled for spring of 2024, so less than a year from now. And then there's the question of whether you can actually organize an election. We just don't know right now. Of course, it's impossible to have normal campaigning in wartime. On the other hand, Ukraine has very well developed electronic state infrastructure now. That's part of what's helped keep it afloat. There's this DIA app and others that have continued to be a portal through which citizens can receive state services, and do a whole lot of things. And so in principle, I could see an election technically being able to happen, through some kind of mechanism like that. I don't know what Olya thinks about this. We don't directly address whether an election is going to be heard or held later. I think my own view is probably that they'll try to find a way to do it, just because I think it's so important to present to themselves in the world that they are a democracy, because that's so central to the message against Russia. That they would try to do it despite efforts to, that Russia would surely have to try to disrupt this somehow. But I don't know. I think still, most people in this circumstance would understand if a country did not have an election under such circumstances and postponed it to some future time, just because it can be very difficult and challenging. Who would run against him? It's really unclear. Would it really be a competition? Maybe not. But my guess is that they'd probably try to do it, but I don't know what your view is on that.
So I think there's first two things that we should talk about. One, as political scientists and those folks who study democratization and what makes democracy, consolidated and resilient, there is a question whether or not ever in the time of such a conflict you should hold elections, right? And theorists are split on this, and there's varying evidence. that in fact, in such a context, an election would lead to greater polarization, potentially other problems within the society. That's for the theorists. Let's talk about the practicalities. There's martial law in Ukraine. According to the law of Ukraine, you cannot hold elections during martial law. So this is a moot point until either the law is changed and you can somehow have an election during martial law, or martial law is lifted. It is unlikely martial law will be lifted if there is a very active phase of conflict. And then again, all of these changes would require buy-in from different political factions. It would have to be voted on in the Rada. This is if this is happening, we will know well in advance that this is happening because it's a multi-month lead-in process. But I agree with Henry that people in Kiev are split on holding it or not holding it and how it can be held in a free and fair manner, whilst protecting Ukrainian citizens from direct and indirect, hybrid and in real life attacks on them during an election. And of course, the question of the many, many, many Ukrainians who are living under occupation and would effectively not have their right to engage in this election. And that is obviously very problematic. So as it stands, the law wouldn't allow for it. We will know very quickly if there are moves to change the law or make this happen. So if it's going to take place in March, April, May, well, surely by this autumn, you will know more than just rumors, as some people have reported on that day.
So actually, before we go to the next question, we have one question online I'd like to pose. And the questioner is asking if you have any data for a possible Zelensky effect on other Ukrainian politicians, besides the usual coattail, that could be for either one of you.
Not quite sure what the question means. You mean?
Was there a Zelensky effect? I don't know, you'll have to define Zelensky effect, but is there a Zelensky effect on other Ukrainian politicians, or is he sort of a unique character in Ukraine, or is he changing the way other people behave? Are they becoming more patriotic or, volunteering more, et cetera, et cetera?
Other
Politicians, yeah.
I think the answer is yes. And I will take this not as my own observations and opinion, which I think, even myself, I came to this conclusion. But several journalists that I work very closely with that have been following specifically local level politicians. And one specific journalist, she's someone I speak to often, so I mention her name quite often, Natalia Gumenyuk, who immediately following the all-out invasion made a point to travel to all the regions she could get access to and follow and trace what was happening at the local level. And she noted while we were writing this book, actually, in an interview we did with her, that local mayors, town council leaders, etc., were mimicking Zelensky's style and then mimicking Zelensky's words and substance. So that is really interesting. And she said this, then several other journalists that were also in the field at the time noted this. And I started following some of these examples that they gave to me on Telegram and how these local individuals, most of them with very little actually experience in politics, were mimicking this style and substance and talking about the civic duty of citizens, and talking about that, literally using the words, that which unites us is stronger than that which can possibly divide us. So I think that's a very direct effect. On other politicians, I'm sure they're trying, certainly in that 2019 election, in the parliamentary election in July, certainly there were a lot of parties trying to mimic kind of what Zelensky and his party were doing, and they failed. That was a massive failure because it wasn't earnest for those politicians or for those parties. It didn't feel like, quite frankly, it feels earnest when he does it, at least for the ordinary median voter in Ukraine.
Okay, so I think we have a question here. I'll get to you.
Thanks. I'm Dan Whitman. I am an adjunct here in African studies, but I also teach myself a course on crisis management for Ukrainian students. We start next Monday and by webinar, and I would love it if anybody would feel free to join and observe. I was in Uzhhorod in June. I love that place. And I was at a dinner with wonderful Ukrainians and an argument broke out. I tried to disappear into the wall and to not have an opinion on this. One of them said, Zelensky doesn't exist. He's really the total of the advisors who tell him what to do every day. Others were very much opposed to that and believed in the Zelensky effect. I think I know your answer on this, but I will ask, to what degree is Zelensky a product of his advisors?
Yeah, so I mean, I think kind of predictably, we tend to think that like he's playing a big role, but I mean, like all leaders, who I think are effective ones, they listen to their advisors and they give them a big role. I don't think we don't buy into the story is that he's like a creature of Yermak or that he's kind of somebody's puppet, and that has been one of the kind of, I guess, tropes or ideas about Zelensky from the beginning. People not taking him seriously as a politician, and maybe you could understand it. He appears in TV in like puffy blue suits and kind of jumping around and singing and dancing on his comedy shows. But that's really to be distracted by the superficial things. And whereas I think what we find is that he's someone who has been pretty savvy in dealing with lots of different people. He's been able to handle oligarchs to rise up to be a strong leader, and he brings people together as part of his team who he thinks will be effective. One of the criticisms of Zelensky, of course, has been that he has a lot of people that come from his entertainment career who've then gone on to take on important positions that would seem out of profile. On the other hand, that's not terribly unusual in the sense that people typically put in places of power when they're in office, people that they trust and that have demonstrated their capacity to be good managers in other ways. And some people have worked out in this capacity, others didn't. He was fairly quick to sideline some people who were less effective in terms of bringing it out. So I guess my sense is he's kind of down the middle, right? He's someone who gives the people below him a certain amount of free rein. He doesn't try to micromanage. There's one big distinction between, say, how Zelensky runs the war versus how Putin runs the war. Putin kind of micromanages the generals, whereas Zelensky has always kind of let them make the calls on the ground. But at the same time, everyone we've talked to, kind of inside indicates that, he's a very active presence, right? I mean, he'll give them general directions, and then, they'll go out and try to do their best.
Yeah, I think there's three things I would like to add to this. First is the logic of this argument. So my friends and family come from the so-called 25%ers, the folks who did not vote for Zelensky, believed he's part of the Russian revanchist plot, still to this day might believe he's part of the Russian revanchist plot, and voted for Petro Poroshenko. So if you can imagine, there were some very interesting dinner conversations since 2019. But the logic of the argument is, first, he's doing everything wrong and you blame it on him. Then when he seems to be doing things right, then it can't possibly be him who's doing it. And there are obviously many of my friends and family who have shifted their view over time. And this is anecdotal. This is not what political scientists normally do, but just as an example. And there are some that have doubled down on this. And in fact, we find this in our data. And we talk about this in the last chapter about who supports Zelensky publicly and privately. And we do this using experimental survey items in order to test this public declaration that you would vote for Zelensky versus perhaps a private one that you would not. And about that 25-26% is the hardcore of people that would not vote for him, but publicly declare that they would. Okay, so nothing has really changed for this group very much since 2019. But that logic is interesting. Two, the folks that we interviewed for the book and the conversations we had are actually a little split on their perception of Zelensky. Certainly not a micromanager in wartime. And I think that has been something that Henry has stressed. And certainly many people report that he really acknowledged where his expertise is lacking and who to listen to there, and apparently that has been the case. But when it comes to economic policy, there were people he had very serious disagreements with, who, unfortunately, in the case of the former prime minister, publicly criticized Zelensky repeatedly and lost their place, right? So there is that element that he was a little bit more forceful on certain policies that he truly believed in, whereas the economists or the folks with economics degrees that were there working with him were very frustrated by that. And we have that on good authority from several different people. When it comes to his speeches, again, I won't mention my family member by name. So he's an actor. He can give you any line. He can say any line in a way that will make you swoon to your knees, which admittedly this person is saying they swooned. But that everything's written for them, right? And that's not really the story we were uncovering over time. Repeatedly, Zelensky has said, Holoborodko's words, the character are my own. What he says, I say. It's a very clever strategy during a presidential election, by the way. We do say in the book that perhaps electoral laws will have to be changed in the future because they did not envisage such a thing. We do say it's somewhat problematic to have a third season of a television show that is running during the campaign, and then when the moment of silence comes, is rerun, right? That's a little bit on the edge there of the rules, not against the rules, though, importantly. But he said repeatedly, those are my own words. Today, obviously, he doesn't have time to write many of his speeches. He says things off the cuff, right? But again, people don't believe that what he has to say comes from him. And we have now confirmations from multiple people who are directly involved in his speech writing that say he throws out ideas, events, historical figures, and then they have to obviously package it up for him. That's understandable. It would be absolutely insane if he had hours upon hours to write these eloquent speeches all the time, but he often changes them. And there's two examples that I like to give that we do write about in the book. On the eve of the all-out invasion, obviously a very tense time, Zelensky's addressing the Ukrainian citizens, and he talks about Ivan Dzuba's passing that night. Ivan Dzuba is a famous Ukrainian dissident. He was a Russian speaker until his 20s from Donetsk, Eastern Ukraine. And he was actually a believer, at least, in the possibilities of a communist future being good for people. But he was against Russian chauvinism and imperialism in Ukraine. And he wrote a very famous treaty to that effect, and delivering it to the Communist Party. Now, you have to love Ivan Dzuba for this, because he truly believed in the possible good of people and delivering a treatise on Russian chauvinism to the Communist Party. He talks about Ivan Dzuba in the middle of a speech on the eve of all-out invasion. He stresses Ivan Dzuba as an example of civic duty among those who grew up speaking Russian in the East that did incredible things and are important and famous in history, right? Another example, a few weeks into the all-out war, in a speech where he was talking about some political parties potentially committing treason, being involved in collaboration, politicians that are committing acts that may be understood as treason or collaboration. In that speech, he interrupts it to mention that the night before was Kostenko, Lina Kostenko's birthday. Lina Kostenko is again a poetess who was part of the dissident cultural movement of the 60s. She's famous in intelligentsia circles, but certainly not necessarily in every single household. He uses her words from her poem. We have it on good authority that he told them specifically that poem and that he remembered it off by heart. Apparently, he was a little bit of a nerd in school. So when we heard that story that he knew this poem off by heart, that really brought that speech together for us. And in fact, we use that poem to parse out the chapters of our book, because the last line of that poem is, if a person has a nation, then they are a person.
Let's do hope. And then there's a question in the back there.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to read the book. To tiny questions and then a question about your writing process. So why is there one Y and not two Ys in Zelensky's name? And on Servant of the People, did he write all the text for his character? Those are the small questions. The big question, I'm always curious as a writer myself, who's thought how neat it would be to co-write something, how did you two, come to this decision, and what was the process of writing together?
Yeah, so one Y, not two Ys, very simple. The publisher insisted on one Y. Our preference was that, but they insisted for marketability and searchability, I guess, reasons at the time. One Y, yeah. And so pretty much everywhere else, we stuck to what we were able to, but that we had to give in on. Did he write all the text? No, there was a collective team of writers, in different episodes. He had different levels of involvement in, but he was generally responsible for all of it. And like Olya said, basically agrees that he says, like, basically what's being said there, is my words, right? I kind of stand by all of this. And as far as the writing goes, well, I guess just first of all, we've been working together since 2014. Basically doing research on, among other things, like identity and politics in Ukraine. So, right after the Euromaidan revolution, we got together, got a grant with the NSF with a couple other scholars, and, we're doing survey research, and we've basically been doing it ever since. And then, at some point, after February 22nd, we kind of realized, okay, well, there's something to be said here. That our research speaks to. And so, the idea for the book was Olya's, that we should actually write a book. And she had the title. And so I was like, okay, that sounds good to me. So let's dive in. And then, it was a lot of kind of back and forth and, discussion and writing and rewriting that kind of, we rewrite what each other wrote until we had something that we thought we were pretty happy with. So in brief, that's like my perspective on it.
It's really easy to work with Henry. I hope he thinks the same. But it's been 8 years worth of conducting research, and this is the product of 8 years worth of research. And several academic papers, as you know, take 4 or 5+ years to get out there. And some of them are touching on elements of what later becomes in our thinking the Zelensky effect. Those papers are still to be out in the academic world in some cases. They're on very specific elements that all the nerdiest of the nerds will enjoy. But yeah, that's what was the product here. And I initially was working, I lead a large project called Mobilize. A lot of the data is from that project in this book. And my plan was to write about just that presidential period, because I thought it was interesting how this particular constituency was moving, specifically in relation to exit and voice, or migration and engagement in politics. When the when Russia invaded Ukraine in the way that it did, when we were involved in various policy work, when I was advising various policy leaders in the United Kingdom, participating in briefings on the media, I had this intense need to correct so many things that people were saying. And I found it so frustrating. On the evening of the 23rd, I was actually on BBC, and this is my friends and family, right? This is when I'm speaking about these things publicly, I am thinking of people that I love. And when the BBC is yet again saying, so, the estimates by American analysts, specifically intelligence, 3 days to 2 weeks, right? So first, your throat catches because you really hope to God that that intelligence is wrong. But then you remind yourself, no, we have 8 years worth of data that we know that intelligence will be wrong. We know that there is something that changed, and we want to tell that story. So that's, I think, where the writing process came to. And luckily, we didn't disagree much, which in our other team, IBIF, we also work with Gwen Sasa and Volodya Kulik. And in that team, we sometimes have very strong disagreements on some things. And here, it was a rather, I think, easy process. And I also I really enjoyed it, Henry. So
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I think one thing is just, we were interviewed by a correspondent from Science News about one of the previous articles that we had written, who had contacted us to see if this could lend insight into the what was going on in the war. And then, wound up being this super long, like hours long interview. And that's where we kind of realized, among other things, we're really kind of on the same page here, and that maybe it could be productive to go forward. Yeah.
So we have a question in the back, and then Gerard.
Thank you so much. My name is Christoph Schuck. I'm from the University of Dortmund in Germany, and I'm currently a visiting professor here at Elliott. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's a very interesting book. I look much forward to reading it. My question goes into the direction, what comes after the war? Let us assume that President Zelensky is still in office after the war. Will the Zelensky effect continue? I mean, we know from conflict studies that usually during war times, people stand together and support their president, but later on, it might be a different story, I guess. There will be many challenges moving the Ukraine towards the European Union, which will be a very, very long way to go. So probably he can also disappoint many people later on. So would you believe that the Zelensky effect continues once the war comes to an end? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big, huge question. So, I think, first of all, yes, that's right. We don't know what will continue after the war, obviously. There are big examples from history that suggest that all kinds of things can happen, right? Churchill leads the UK, right, to victory in World War II, and then is voted out of office because he's not the right person considered to lead the rebuilding effort. So something like that, could easily happen to Zelensky, even if he manages the war successfully and is regarded as a hero. But even if he stays and remains popular, there are just so many variables that can come up. I mean, I think, one of the things that we talk about is how, victory in a war can also provide kind of a crystallizing moment to realize a lot of things that have been impossible to realize before. And so, when we talk about corruption and problems like that, one of the problems there is just it's the expectation that things are always going to be this way, right? And this is just the way things get done. I don't like it, but I have to engage in it, because there's no other way to get anything done. And in fact, this is a key part of Zelensky's message, through his entertainment programming, is people themselves have to take ownership of their own situations and work to change this. But of course, it's a big collective action problem, because you have to convince everybody at the same time not only not to do this, but you have to convince them that everybody else is also going to change their behavior. And so, his election, may have made some progress, right? But it didn't have this totally transformative impact. But, victory in a war is something that possibly could, if he remains, kind of resolved to affect that kind of change. And, if it is in fact a victory, right, which we, who knows what's going to happen, right? Or maybe if it winds up being some kind of unpopular compromise, right? There are all kinds of variables that could impact this, but I think those are two, of the issues that face. There's a lot of opportunity there, especially with a positive outcome that, with the reinforcement of Europe, including all the challenges that it brings, could lead to a very positive breakthrough. But on the other hand, there's just a lot that could go wrong, right? Especially, if he starts to take himself too seriously, if people start to see him as indispensable, if he starts to think, well, this opposition to me is really somehow anti-national or weakening the national defense. There are all kinds of thinking traps that leaders get into, that I think will be big challenges for Ukraine. So, I think there's an unusual possibility that the Zelensky effect could continue and be a very positive thing for Ukraine moving forward. But there's just so much uncertainty now, but at least that's how I would frame the question and frame thinking about it.
So in the interest of time, we have two last questions. So Gerard.
This is a great book. I just finished it. I have read it, and it's not a hagiography, which I was fearful that it might be. It's really a very sort of in-depth analysis of who he is. You get a sense of how substantive he is and how he has sort of core beliefs. But it's also a story of the independence generation. So I learned a lot from it, and it's terrific. And I would really recommend it. You mentioned Mikhail Saakashvili in it and he's one of those figures that you mentioned him a few times, or both of you mentioned him a few times in the book. He's one of those figures who potentially could be compared to Zelensky. You will have seen that Franklin Foer's new book has a discussion of how Zelensky's first meeting with Biden didn't go well because Zelensky essentially was going on about something about NATO, which Biden interpreted as a conspiracy theory, didn't like it. And so that reminded me of Saakashvili. Is it a case that Zelensky is in the ilk of Saakashvili, in other words, a crusader who can never make a compromise? Or is it possible that you could have a moment where he is able to say and able to make a really hard decision, which is we have to make a peace and we have to endorse a peace. It's going to be an ugly peace. It's not going to be one that we want, but we have to endorse it. And the reason why I asked that question is because my own research with Karina Korstelina, when we do a Zelensky endorsement, it moves the needle in terms of whether people will support peace negotiations involving territorial concessions.
We're grabbing
Oh, we're doing two in a row.
Oh, we could, yeah. If you want to, yes, go ahead and then because we're a little bit over time, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair just to.
Carter Johnson with American Council here. Thank you for the presentation. A quick question on the, you made a very compelling case for why it should have been so obvious that Ukrainians would rally around the country before, but it wasn't so obvious to most people, both lay people and, as you point out, even intelligence officers that are focused their whole careers on this. In the UK, you mentioned, the Germans thought this would fall in 48 hours. The Russians thought Ukraine would fall very quickly. So why did everyone get it so wrong? I mean, is that they weren't following your research? Is that the real answer? Are there other parts? Are there other blinders that are on? How come that was such a big failure in this lead up to the war?
I think the two questions are actually in a way connected. I don't see Zelensky as a crusader per se at all. I actually see him as sometimes somebody I strongly disagree with, but nonetheless, a person that is quite clever and is able to negotiate different things internally. I think some of the moves we're seeing now with the new Minister of Defense and the bringing into the fold of people from different political factions into ministerial posts, we're going to be seeing a big reshuffle right now. I think those are signals that he, in fact, has kept doors open in within political factions where he had some of the most serious critique. But why is the expectation that he should accept a compromise, specifically if it's territorial secession? And why do we in any way think that that is a way that will bring an end to war? I do not. And I think analysts are strongly, those who propose this are strongly mistaken that territorial concessions would create a true and lasting peace. Absolutely not. There is no indication that Russia has ever stuck to any of the agreements in relation to Ukraine. And moreover, the ideology, the imperial attitude to Ukraine, the history of how Russia has repeatedly colonized and oppressed Ukraine over and over again, the views that Putin has eloquently told us, so believe him, he has said it more than once, of how he views Ukraine and Ukrainian history and Ukrainians as non-people, as non-existent. There's nothing there that we should take to think that territorial concessions would lead to a long and lasting peace. Maybe a secession and fighting, not a long and lasting peace. I think also one that would not be accepted, in fact, by ordinary citizens, and we have data on that. But why does everyone get it wrong? Or why did everyone get it wrong? I think we do not. Some of the other things that have changed over time, Ukrainians have changed over time. Ukrainians themselves have moved to civic, pro-Euro-Atlanticist, pro-NATO positions earlier than we were reporting on it. Why? Perhaps we weren't asking the right questions. Perhaps we weren't tracking it well enough. Perhaps we didn't want to believe what we saw as a trend when the trend was developing. I don't know what the answers are, but we are often stuck in places where I know what I know to be true, and we tend to look for evidence that supports us. We know that. That is a problem for us humans more generally in our psychology. I think to this day, people do that with Ukrainians. People do not acknowledge that although corruption is a huge problem and it's systemic, there have been major steps towards less and less corruption in certain sectors. There have been reforms that have been very important. Although historically there were unfree and unfair elections, that was not a consistent pattern over time. And in fact, Ukraine has repeatedly shown that that is not the case. And we can go on and give examples, but if people don't want to see Ukraine through that lens, then they will not. If people do not want to believe that the Ukrainian citizens who in '92 started moving very strongly to civic national identity positions, and we have evidence that in all large Russian-speaking cities, we talk about this in the book, you had this big jump to the civic identification. If you don't want to believe that over 30 years, because the evidence is that quite frankly that long, then the problem is with you, not you. But and for me, I can only speak personally. In 2019, I did not see Zelensky as a positive development in Ukrainian politics. But when the data started showing me something else, I took a seat back. I ran a few more analyses and I saw a difference. And I think there's at least a few people in the room who have heard me present on some of these things since 2019 that have seen that we were challenged on these points repeatedly. And the data was showing this development. So we also have to check our own selves. If I did not want to believe what I was seeing, I could have just put it to the side, and what we found in other papers, we could have just ignored it because it wasn't showing what we were expecting it to show.
Yeah, and maybe I just add very briefly because we're out of time. I mean, I do think that if we set aside kind of territory, which I think is like maybe a longer discussion there, there's certainly other areas where I could see him, pushing unpopular, concessions, say on like what to do with war crimes, reparations, sanctions on Russia, when and whether they should be lifted, things like that. I mean, if he is convinced, through the circumstances that, making concessions on those issues will save lives and ultimately be good for Ukraine, I could see him trying to like lead opinion rather than go against it, even though, our research also shows there's substantial opposition, latent opposition, potential opposition in Ukraine, to such moves, right? But I could see him doing that. I think there are other reasons related to territory that, would make it unlikely he would take a lead like for any kind of territorial concessions. But yeah, in terms of the kind of why do people get it wrong? I mean, I pretty much just second what Olya says is, it's just a misunderstanding of like the implications of a lot of research that's out there, right? There's a lot of research on kind of, divides in Ukraine. And of course, there's political, diversity in Ukraine, and there very strongly, differences. And there's large numbers of Ukrainians who up until not that long ago supported tight economic integration with Moscow. That doesn't mean they wanted to be ruled by Moscow or would easily cave into that. And I think that was something that wasn't always understood, that you can have kind of strong political differences, even about geographic orientation, but that didn't necessarily mean that, the whole state would collapse, right? People can be very dissatisfied with their government and not necessarily, support foreign rule in response to that, right? And, institutions are unpopular, lots of countries, right? Looking around here in Washington, right? And, it doesn't mean that the whole thing is going to kind of, collapse or be susceptible to some foreign power coming in and asserting authority. So, that would be another way, which I'd kind of just, I think we try to reflect in the book that, is part of like what some of the problem was in terms of anticipation. It was sort of this underestimation of the strength of Ukrainian statehood and identity, based on kind of extrapolating a little too far from some of the statistics that don't look so pretty.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. So please join me in thanking our two speakers. Sounds like if the students want the books, they can